On the 25th of June, criminal gangs were deployed by politicians on a peaceful protest in Nairobi. Bandits armed with whips and clubs confronted demonstrators marching to commemorate the lives of 60 people killed a year earlier in a wave of protests against a controversial finance bill.
It's a peaceful march to represent those we lost, and we're here to also cry out for justice for them.
The gangs assaulted and raped protesters and torched and looted businesses in an attempt to place the blame on the demonstrators. Meanwhile, the state banned live broadcast coverage of the protests and switched off leading television stations. 8 people were reportedly killed and hundreds were left seriously injured. But these attacks appeared to be calculated and funded by senior politicians. A video circulating in Kenya appears to show William Kassait Kamket, a legislator and supporter of President Ruto, saying he will sponsor bandits to confront protesters.
Twende Nairobi, tupambane na hao, tuwaonyeshe, waone noma, waone shida, wasirudie, watuletee uoga. Wale vijana watatoka sehemu hii, watawaonyesha maana ya kukimbia ni nini.
Criminal gangs are entrenched in Kenya's political landscape. Post-election violence in 2007 saw more than 600,000 people displaced and 1,000 killed in inter-ethnic attacks in which criminal gangs instigated violence. In today's landscape, gangs are hired as private bodyguards during campaign rallies, as well as to threaten and assassinate political rivals and contest election results through violent demonstrations. According to the Organised Crime Index, Mafia-style groups have a significant impact on the country's democratic processes, scoring 7 out of 10. Meanwhile, state-embedded actors also have a high score at 8 out of 10, undermining state responses and allowing gangs to gain control in Kenya. With me to discuss this problem is Ken Opala, the founding director of the African Investigative News Service and field network coordinator for East and Southern Africa for the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. Ken conducted a series of interviews with gang members and the police in Kenya in June about this incident. Ken, thank you for joining me. Now, my first question is, how common is it for gangs to work for politicians in Kenya?
It's a very commonplace, and any politician of repute must have a gang to serve them for a number of activities, whether it's assassinating rivals, whether acting as bodyguards. It's really commonplace in Kenya, and if you look at the Kenyan politics carefully, about 90% of the politics in this country are controlled by gangs. Rather, gangs control about 90% of the Kenyan politics. So criminal gangs are a really commonplace feature in Kenya's politics.
Now, the fact that politicians sponsored the gangs who turned up at the protests on June 25th that we were talking about earlier isn't widely reported on. And also in the media, these gangs are often referred to as goons. So how did you find out that politicians had paid for the gangs to disrupt the protests in Nairobi?
One is that I think the concept of criminal gangs is not really well known in Nairobi in terms of definition, and the media doesn't seem to get it right. If you look at the kind of organization of the violence in Nairobi, definitely it's not just about hired goons. Those basically were criminal gangs, and that's what came to my mind when I went out to investigate. So I went out and spoke with a number of them. I spoke with the police, and I spoke with security analysts. So what came out is that these are criminal gangs and not just hired goons.
Can you explain the thought process of the people who were involved in this, in breaking up the June protests? Like, why do they get involved in politics? Whether they have any concerns themselves about this sort of crossover between like organized crime and politics?
One thing about the Kenyan politics that is heavily polarized along government and the opposition. And any dissent in Kenya is seen as anti-government. Anybody with a differing view is seen as anti-government. So what happens is that leading people in government will want to have the protests appear as if they are organized by the opposition. So any violence that comes out in the protests is seen as being instigated by the opposition. And that is basically what's happening in this case, that the government wants any violence, any criminality as be associated with the opposition. And that's why some leading people in the government or people associated allied to government will always want to come and seem to counter the protests. And that of course involves hiring criminal gangs and militia to come and counter any peaceful protests.
Do you also, sort of elicit any, any interesting tidbits when you were talking to the gang members? How do they get involved in this in the first place? Like how do the politicians hire them? How do they get involved with, in doing something like this?
Criminal gangs, of course, are there for one purpose: is to make gains, to benefit, and basically commercially. And in Kenya, we sort of have so many unemployed youth, so many of them ready to do any dirty work for some few coins. So when someone comes up with a good proposal or proposition that involves the unemployed earning some money, they are ready to jump to that offer, and that's what's happened. So when I was speaking with them, I was speaking with the gang members. One is that they were offered money, and two is that they were told that the protests will give them the opportunity to go and loot from supermarkets and business premises. So, I mean, for them, that was a good opportunity for them to make some little money and get some little property here and there.
So I guess one big factor that drives these gang members to get involved in this kind of thing is socioeconomic, unemployment, and perhaps poverty.
Unemployment is terribly high in Kenya. The cost of living is high in Kenya. So that mix, of course, makes people really vulnerable to any offer that can help pull them out of whatever economic misery or something. So when such offers come, people don't sit down and look at the consequences mostly, especially the unemployed youth. And given that they were promised that police will be there to protect them and provide security, so that of course meant that the risk was low, and that of course was attractive. It's a magnet to whoever wanted to go on the streets to counter the peaceful protests.
You also said earlier about how polarized, politics and political parties are in Kenya, and I guess a really sad and tragic example was, the post-election violence in 2007 when more than 1,000 people were killed, right? Can you tell us how the landscape has changed since then, or perhaps not? And do these events, like, the violence in the post-election that we saw in 2007, the protests that we saw last year, most recently in June, do they impact the way people engage in politics?
What happened in the 2007 elections is that the opposition contested the results, the presidential results. And then what happened was mayhem. There was so much killing after the results were announced. So there was so much violence over the outcome, and took about 1 month of really killings. And then ICC came in, and a number of Kenyans, 6 of them, were charged with the crimes against humanity. Among them was the current president, that's William Ruto, and his predecessor, that's Uhuru Kenyatta. So they were left the hook because of insufficient evidence. But I think the ICC, the intervention, seemed to send a strong word that Kenya was being watched and any violence would be taken seriously. So there was some level of fear after the ICC intervention. After that violence, there seemed to be been a lull until recently, and that lull comes because of the intervention by the ICC at The Hague. After 2008, 2007, the next election was 2013, and there were about I think less than 30 people were killed. Then there was that one of 2017. There were not so many people were killed. 2022, not so much. But already, what we have seen, the killing over the last month, of course, eclipses the fatalities that we experienced in the last 20 years after the post-election violence. So what I'm saying is that whereas there was that intervention by the ICC, I think people seem to have forgotten. We sort of seems to be now getting back to that situation we were in before the 2007 and the 2000 election. We seem to be getting back to that period, which is very unfortunate.
That's really interesting because the next general election coming up is in 2027, which is, 20 years after the 2007 elections. How do you think, this connection between politics, organized crime, and violence impact, Kenya during elections? And are you concerned about the upcoming elections?
My fear is that, based on what's happened over the last 2 months, is that criminal gangs are regrouping. And we seem to have forgotten about the 2007 elections. We are back to the default mode. And my fear is that we are likely to have violence in the next election. And what happens in Kenya is that re-election violence is always, to use the wrong word, fatal. That re-election, the succession politics in Kenya are very, very violent. And the next election will be basically about this regime seeking re-election. So unless we move so fast and deal with the issue to do with the violence in this country, we are likely to see a violent election in 2027.
Do the people involved, the gangs as well as the politicians hiring them, do they ever face legal consequences? Or, is this issue ever tackled in a systemic manner?
Why we brought in ICC just because our laws on the judicial system doesn't seem to take this thing serious, or take it seriously. Our laws basically are inadequate, and we seem to deal with their laws don't seem to draw a nexus between election violence and organized crime. So basically, when those ones arrested are charged with violence, and at worst perhaps robbery or violence, so it's basically looked at as petty violence and not an issue of organized criminal activity. That's the problem, and that's what we need to fix. So that we need to, as a country, we need to draw a nexus between election violence. We need to do criminal violence and organized criminal activity. If we don't do that, then we won't be able to arrest and prosecute the sponsors of this kind of violence. We'll be dealing with the rank and file and not the main sponsors of the violence.
As a quick follow-up question, are there any signs that is something that is likely to happen? Are there any signs that policymakers or or even perhaps the international community is trying to make that case, make that linkages between political violence and organized crime, and take the electoral violence as a serious issue? Are there any signs of this happening?
Authorities are yet to accept that this is organized criminal activity. And as I told you earlier, the issue of polarization of Kenyan politics, that the government already seems to think that the opposition is behind the violence. And the opposition is, of course, is convinced that the violence is at the hand of the government. So there's this blame game. What does that tell you? That we're really far from seeing some solution. We're really far from having this issue addressed.
Yeah, in 2027. That's a very sobering thought. Well, thank you very much, Ken, for joining me on this episode of The Index. To learn more about criminality and resilience in Kenya, you can head over to the Organized Crime Index at ocindex.net.